Tonight we dive into a topic that has been at the heart of fierce debates and intense emotions for decades: abortion. In the Bahamas, abortion remains illegal, a reflection of our deeply rooted Christian values and moral convictions. But why is that the case? And as our society evolves, should our approach to this sensitive issue evolve as well? Abortion is a subject cloaked in taboo, often whispered about in hushed tones and met with judgment. Yet, despite the legal and societal constraints, there is a growing chorus of voices, predominantly women, calling for a more progressive stance on abortion legislation. They argue that access to safe and legal abortions is not just a matter of a personal choice, but a fundamental right that impacts women's health, autonomy, and equality. But is this dream of legislative change in the Bahamas merely an unrealistic aspiration, especially when we look at our northern neighbors, the United States, where a landmark decision that once protected abortion rights has been overturned? In January of 2022, the Supreme Court's decision to reverse Roe v. Wade marked the beginning of what many see as the dismantling of women's reproductive rights in the United States, a nearly 50-year-old precedent undone, sparking a wave of legal and societal repercussions. As we navigate this complex and emotionally charged topic tonight, we will hear from distinguished guests who bring diverse perspectives to the table: a pro-life stance grounded in religious and moral principles, and a pro-choice position emphasizing women's rights and bodily autonomy. So stay tuned as we get started on the other side of this break. This is On the Record. In this first segment, we delve into the pro-life perspective on abortion. This stance is often deeply rooted in religious and moral convictions, and it represents a significant portion of our society's views on this very contentious issue. To provide insight into this perspective, we have honored to have with us well-known pastor, Pastor Mario Moxey. So welcome to On the Record.
It's so good to be here.
It's interesting. You and I have spoken in so many different circles at so many different times. This is the first time you've actually been on this show.
And I feel so honored. I feel like I'm one of the privileged now.
I feel that it took so long. Anyway, so welcome. So let's start with talking about really what are the core principles that underpin the pro-life stance?
At the very core of it has to do with the sanctity of life. We believe that all life is precious. And of course, the primary scripture for this is in Psalms 139. It says, "You've made all my delicate inner parts in my body." And then he goes on to say, "I am fearfully and wonderfully made." And so we understand that God does all of this incredible work. And he says, not only that the delicate and the innermost parts of my body, but he said, you knit them together in the womb. So we know that life begins in the womb. And it's a fundamental thing for most Christians that we all agree on is the sanctity of life, how important that unborn child is.
There are many who, whether they're in the church or without, will say, as time changes, the interpretations of the scripture changes and circumstances change. How do you respond to that criticism?
Circumstances do change. The word, however, is timeless. It's not best practices that we have. These are principles that we have. And principles, they endure forever. One of the things that we see in society now is the fact that we don't have moral absolutes. You know, we believe everything evolves. We believe that everything is based on the seasons and the times that we're in. And because the times have changed, then we need to evolve our values. But values from a biblical perspective are timeless. And this is the reason why we go back to the Bible, because if we forget, we have the scripture to remind us of what those principles actually are.
How do you reconcile, though, the pro-life position with the complex and often distressing circumstances that women face when considering an abortion? It's not always just a matter of whether you want to keep the child or not. Women will tell you there are often extenuating circumstances.
And these are things that we have to be mindful of. And right off the bat, I can think of one of those circumstances as it relates to rape, for example. It is one of the most heart-wrenching things for any of us to even fathom. And for a woman to go through that, it's a very awful experience. It's a very painful experience. And we're mindful of that. There is still life in that wound, and it's important for us to appreciate both sides of that coin, not to diminish one over the other, but to create ways whereby both can receive the ministry that they need. One of the things that oftentimes we don't talk about as it relates to abortion, whether it is in one of those egregious situations or it's something that is voluntarily done, is the aftermath that the woman carries with her, the regret later on in life. And we would love to avoid that. And so one of the things we can do is provide her with the care that she needs, the support, the counseling that she needs through that pregnancy period. And the number one remedy for that is adoption. That way, both the mother receives the help that she so desperately needs, and the community, we are to be our brother's keeper to support her throughout that process. And the child also is redeemed or saved through providing that child for abortion. So we have to look at it from both sides and see how we can help. I don't think as a society we're doing everything that we can to help pregnant mothers during their time of pregnancy.
How do you counsel that woman, though, who has to take this baby to term with that trauma and then an additional trauma of having now to be separated from that child at abortion, as you are suggesting?
And it is, again, it is something where there is help and counsel to provide assistance for that through every stage of that traumatic situation. But it's the individual, again, reaching to this point and having the choice of whether or not they do want to abort or keep the child. It's not necessary that they have to adopt the child, send the child for adoption.
Right.
They still can keep the child. So it's important for us to have the conversation, though, and provide a much larger spectrum for that mother to make the right choices where there aren't any regrets later on in life. And it's a very painful situation. You know, as men, we don't experience that. A woman goes through that
Sure.
in an emotional manner. It's psychological in a lot of ways. And this is the reason why help is needed every step of the way.
My late mother used to say, "Man, no, I'm children."
Exactly.
She always say that, she said there are certain conversations, your daddy can have with me. But anyway, I think you brought up a very interesting point to all of this, and the help, the psychological, the counseling, the financial assistance. I don't always get the sense, Pastor, that we have those things in place to support our women.
I don't get the impression that we do neither. And to be honest, I think even the church can do better. I'll take it one step further. I think I can do better. There was a situation recently where one of our members got pregnant. And of course, at our church, we teach celibacy. We teach abstinence. It's not old-fashioned. Premarital sex is still a sin. It always was a sin. And so this is what we teach. One of our volunteers became pregnant. And there's a certain degree of shame and guilt that comes along with that. Mm-hmm. I got a call from the leader that said, she's in this situation, you know about this situation, but you haven't called her. And she feels rejected.
Good point.
I'm the pastor.
Yep.
And I felt that, I was guilty of that. And so immediately I called and I check on her because I want to make sure that I'm not conveying the wrong message to her. All of us have sinned and fall short. And so it's important for us to recognize that with sin there comes repentance, but then there also is acceptance. And it's important for us to love people. And I'm saying that because as a society, we don't always embrace, especially mothers who are pregnant in their teenage years, young singles who are pregnant, and they're in the church. We don't always embrace them. We kind of treat them as though they're cursed, and we can do a whole lot better in bringing them in and making sure they get the care.
Going to say, sometimes you hear of, instances where young women are trying to abort children themselves or going through these backdoor, abortions, putting their own lives at risk. Do you think it has a lot to do with the condemnation that comes with
There's a stigma.
Church, family, even school, that makes that young lady or that young woman feel trapped and like she has no alternative?
There's a young lady that just wrote a book. Her name is Darlene Sands Nixon. She wrote a book, Don't Lose Hope. And the book is her journey on motherhood, the journey of loss, resilience, and the miraculous gift of motherhood. And in her book, she speaks about abortion, that she went through that abortion. And I encourage, teenage girls to get a copy of the book, because in it, she speaks about that season, that time in her life where, to be honest, I don't want to share too much about the book because I want people to read it, but her mother only found out about her abortion 30 years later.
Wow.
And so this is something that she went through all by herself. And thankfully she was able to get the help that she needs, and that regret that she felt, she was able to overcome. But these are the issues that so many, and you're absolutely correct, they turn to these butch doctors that help with these procedures, and they're unsafe. So we do need comprehensive medical care, not just for abortion, but to be able to take a young lady or a woman through full term and provide them with prenatal and postnatal care. All that's extremely important, and we have to look at that from a more comprehensive healthcare perspective.
What role should the church be playing in this national conversation about abortion? I bring you here to get your views, but what kind of conversation should the church be having? And let me just start off by saying, not the one where just condemning the premarital sex or having sex, before marriage or outside of them or whatever other circumstances, but what role should the church be playing in this national conversation?
The first thing is that we should not condemn. That's the very first thing. We are the ones at the forefront that can do so much good in this type of environment by not condemning, but opening our arms and embracing mothers in this situation. And we can do that without condoning sin. I think it's very important. I think pastors struggle with this. If we do that, does that mean we're condoning sin? No, it doesn't mean that we're condoning sin, but we're taking care of that mother. And the unspoken thing, just like the woman caught in adultery, where was the man? No woman gets pregnant by herself. So we need to have these broader conversations of planned parenthood. We need to have conversations related to the man. We need to embrace the mother and step in and help. We've just recently, someone contacted us and asked us for assistance in our hospitals. If you're going to take a baby home, you have to have a car seat. So we were able to assist. These are things that churches can do because we have persons in our congregation that have need. Just being there from a presence, with that mother, as in the case, like I was not with this young lady in our church. I was not present. I meant well. I didn't condemn or anything, but it just takes.
You never reached out.
I never reached out. It takes minimum effort to pick up a telephone call and says, listen, I love you. I want you to know God loves you. And we're going to see you through this process. And when this is done, you're going to pick your head up and we're going to bring you back. And it's going to be wonderful. But there is a level of shame. And I do understand that many mothers carry with them. The church can do more.
So In cases of rape or incest, how does the pro-life stance address the needs and rights of the victim? I think we started to talk about it in the case of rape, but how do you address the needs of the victim? And when you're talking now about incest, which creates even another issue,
a layer of complexity,
because there's a safety issue now or developmental issue for the unborn child.
You know, there are two things here. One is we have to be very mindful as we talk about the right of the mother, right? Because that's the other aspect of this conversation as well, that the woman has a right to her body. The other aspect of that is the unborn child also has a right. We believe in the sanctity of life, but there's also a moral and ethical dilemma in that thou shalt not commit murder. So who is it going to be the authority to determine who lives and who dies? It's a moral and ethical dilemma. It's not just based on from a Christian perspective, but this is societal. And so it's important that somebody stands up for the right of the unborn in these instances. The other aspect of this is we have to look at this from the potential of the unborn child. We don't know. We're not God. We can't determine what that potential what the potential of that child is going to be. We have no idea. You know, one of the things that Jeremiah speaks about, he says, God says, before you were formed in your mother's womb, I knew you, I called you, I sanctified you, I called you as a prophet. So we have no idea. We know that God placed purposes in people before they're even born. We don't know what the potential of anybody is. So it's important for us not to act as though we are God to determine who lives and who dies, even in those extraneous situations.
To that mother who may have multiple children already, finds herself in a economically depressed situation, maybe not the best marriage, and now another child is about to enter. And she is thinking, how am I going to provide? What kind of life am I going to give this child? Adoption is not an option.
Why isn't adoption an option?
For a mother who has a house of children, full of children already, and to give away a child, what kind of impact could that possibly have on that family? Even starting with the husband?
Well, we start with having the conversation. We start with having the conversation with the entire family. And they're the realities of, here's a pregnancy. Do we then determine that we're going to terminate this pregnancy, or do we, the conversation that we need to have is with those families that are trying to have babies and they can't. And they will do anything to adopt a baby. So it's not as though we have a shortage on families that can't have children or looking for children. We're able to serve an entire higher purpose by allowing that child to go with another family. And there are all sorts of adoption arrangements today that are available, accessible, where that mother can still have somewhat of a relationship with that child. But that child is now under the guardianship of someone else. So there are options. It's important that we don't handcuff ourselves and get to this place of, well, we can't do this because of this. Even in a family circumstance like that, adoption is possible.
How do you respond to the argument that banning abortion infringes on a woman's right to make decisions about their own bodies? As I said before, not only does a woman have a right to make, and we believe in autonomy, we believe that the woman should have autonomy of her body, every human being, but where do we cross that line and we begin to think about the autonomy of that unborn child? A baby's heartbeat starts at about 5 weeks into gestation period, 5 weeks. And you can test it by ultrasound equipment and so forth. By the end of the 6th week, it's a little more distinguishable from that perspective. So you can hear a heartbeat of another human being at such an early stage in the pregnancy. That child has a right to live, and no one should be able to take that right away from that child. So yes, a woman has a right to her body, but here's another human being. Having a right to the body doesn't mean that you get to play God and terminate a pregnancy and then live with those consequences later on down in life. Stories of so many women who have done that and lived to regret it. What are your thoughts on the possibility of implementing more comprehensive sex education and access to contraception as a means to reducing the number of abortions and even unwanted pregnancies?
Contraception is a very, very controversial topic in the church. There are some that believe that it should not be, and there are those that are for it. There isn't a defining line when it comes to contraceptions. Persons have the right to determine, and we see this in marriages in particular, they have that right to determine whether they want to use contraceptives or not. It gets muddy when we start talking about handing contraceptions to teenagers and then giving license to for sexual relations. Of course, the church position, it will always be abstinence. The church position will always be celibacy. And that's where the tension comes. So there's always going to be this back and forth in terms of what is right, what is the moral stance the church should have. Should we compromise on the stance of celibacy and you know?
The abstinence and celibacy are the church's position. But the reality is these teenagers and children are having sex. That is the reality that we are facing. So then what becomes the answer? Do we still continue to preach the same thing, or do we begin to introduce some things that could probably stop or curtail? Because the reality is it's happening, and unfortunately seems to even be happening at a younger age now. Children seem to be sexualized a lot earlier for many reasons.
Yeah. And there are a number of factors for that. And it comes back down to the home environment. You know, what are the moral values and the principles that we're teaching at home as parents? We need to instill those values. Children have access to social media, and so they're seeing a lot of things. They're educating themselves on their own reproductive systems and their health care, and they're taking care of that themselves. They're doing that all on their own. The church voice is one that must be consistent and must stand strong in all circumstances. And so it's a value position, it's a principle position of abstinence and celibacy.
And so that's your position. Yeah.
It's like I said, it's a very controversial. The reality of it is, even within churches, you're going to find that position. Some lean more towards contraceptives and birth control, while others kind of very strong on that line.
On abstinence. All right. Yeah. Sir, how, as a society now, how do we begin to lean more into this discussion? We see right next door, in the United States, where a change in the abortion law has become a very contentious issue, even as they are going into a presidential election. Do you see this becoming something that lands at our doorstep very soon? Do you see this as something we are going to have to grapple with as a country, this whole issue of the legalization of abortion?
It is something that we're going to have to grapple with. And I think we have to also realize the impetus for all of this. When I was in Bible school some years ago, next year we'll probably be celebrating our 30th anniversary as pastors, Pastor Erica and I. Wow. But when I was in Bible school, the issue back then in America had to do with partial birth abortion. There's been bans on partial birth abortions. Now it is resurfacing again. But it's resurfacing for another reason. Back then it was because people just wanted to have the abortion. And partial birth abortion was exactly as it implies. Mm-hmm. The baby is not completely delivered. The head is still in the womb, but the rest of it is out. And they use an instrument, a surgical instrument, to terminate the baby and vacuum the baby out of the womb. It's a very inhumane process that was being done at the time. Now, today, it's being done because they can harvest the organs of that baby for other medical reasons. So this is the surge. The reason why this thing has come back to the forefront again is because there's economic value in abortion. You can now harvest the organs of an aborted baby. This is horrific. The thing that society has stooped to this level of wanting to monetize human life in this way. And I pray that we never grapple with this in our country. But the reality of it is sometimes these things come upon us. As you can see, we're dealing with a number of issues that we didn't before deal with. And now we're having to wrestle with them, all for economic gain. You know, the money tends to be the source of why men sink to the levels of...
You could say it, root of all evil.
The love of money, the root of all evil. And that's what it all boils down to.
It's still, we're out of time in this segment, and I thank you for coming on and intelligently discussing this issue. I have to be honest with you, when we thought about who we wanted to bring on someone who could sit and really help us to dissect the pro-life stance. And thank you very much for sharing and giving us a lot to think about. I think sometimes we're influenced and we make up our minds just based on information, but it's good to be able to sit and to listen and to unpack and to dissect.
It's a very emotive topic, and it cuts people in so many different ways. And my care is always towards those who are going through it, that they do have care during the entire process, and then also those who would have had abortions in the past and then wrestling with the conflicts of that God still wants to heal, and it is possible for them to have healing.
Pastor Moxey, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Give your wife my best.
Of course.
As I have said this to my viewers, as I reminded him, I remember the weekend he and his wife met. She and I worked together, and she came to work and talked with this handsome man she stood with in the way.
Oh, come on. Stop.
It also tells me how old I am. Please give her my best and all the best to you, sir.
Thank you so much for sharing that, and I can't wait to tell her about that.
All right. We thank you again for your thoughts. When we come back, we get the views of another side of the on the debate line. Stay with us. You are watching On the Record. Back to On the Record. In this second segment, we turn our focus to the pro-choice perspective on abortion. This viewpoint emphasizes women's rights, bodily autonomy, and the importance of access to safe and legal abortion services. We are joined by Alicia Wallace, women's rights activist, public educator, and the director of Equality Bahamas. Alicia, welcome to On the Record, and thank you so much for joining us here tonight.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here.
All right, so let's start by explaining the key arguments that underpin the pro-choice perspective on abortion.
The pro-choice position in support of the right to choose an abortion is really within the larger context of sexual and reproductive health and rights. And when we talk about sexual and reproductive health and rights, often abbreviated to SRHR, we're talking about a full spectrum of care and services and education that should be provided to everyone. So, of course, we're starting with sexuality education, comprehensive sexuality education that should be provided to everyone and included in the school curriculum. We're also talking about access to contraception. We're talking about access to doctors to be able to have conversations about family planning, about our bodies, about what we would like to do with our bodies and what our bodies are capable of. And we're also talking about that prenatal care, postpartum care, and of course, the choice to not continue a pregnancy. So we're talking about bodily autonomy and having enough information to know that we do have the right to make decisions about our bodies. And it just does not just begin with the decision to or not to have sex, but also the decision that we make if there is an unwanted and unintended pregnancy.
How do you respond to the moral and ethical concerns raised by those who oppose abortion, those who say that, the fetus's heartbeat starts at 5 weeks, full on at 6 weeks? How do you respond to those critics?
Morality is really thrown around a lot and used as an excuse to oppress people and to restrict people's access to their human rights. And when we're talking about morality, we're talking about right and wrong. And it seems as though the people with the moral argument, the people who want to talk about ethics, don't necessarily want to talk about what it is wrong or right to impose upon people, and in particular upon women and women's bodies. Is it right to force a person, could be a child, it could be a teenager, it could be an adult, to carry a pregnancy to term when they don't want that pregnancy? And we know that there are many ways that pregnancy comes about. It is not always consensual activity. And even if it is consensual activity, we don't have the resources, the education being provided to help people sufficiently to prevent unwanted pregnancies. And we do know that accidents do happen. Sometimes contraceptives fail. And this position, this moral position actually is quite immoral in that it is putting forward the idea that there is a punishment that women need to carry for any failings of contraception, whether it was due to lack of information or just the failure of the product itself or the practice itself. This idea that, well, now you're pregnant and that is the price that you have to pay for sex or for the sexual violence that you have experienced that we also victimize women for.
What about those who those pro-life advocates who are standing on or say they are here to protect the rights of the unborn child, of the unborn fetus?
There is no protection that they want to talk about the people who are already here, which is actually quite interesting and very frustrating. And it's interesting to hear from people who have not really studied the biology, who are not really interested in hearing from medical professionals about the various stages of pregnancy and where we go from a zygote when we go to when we actually get to the fetal stage. And in most cases, people are seeking abortions very early on as soon as they find out that they are pregnant and they don't want to continue that pregnancy. And this just undergirds that importance of having sexuality education and having the understanding of how our bodies work, how the cycles work, how to identify whether or not a person is pregnant, how do you access pregnancy tests, what does it look like to even go into a pharmacy and try to get a pregnancy test? You actually have to ask for it because it's behind a glass. And these kinds of things can cause people to kind of wait it out thinking, maybe it's just late, I'm still waiting for my period, I'm not really sure, we used a condom. There are these delays, and we have to ensure that people are able to recognize what is happening in their bodies much earlier, and also trust that people will make the right decision for themselves, provided that we ensure that they have all of the information that they need. And for those that really want to be very moral about this and think about right and wrong and what's on their conscience, we do have to turn to human rights standards. And we can look at the most basic human rights document, which is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that lays out very clearly that we are all entitled to the freedom of conscience, the freedom of thought, the freedom of religion, and none of us should be governed by the thought, conscience, or religion of another person.
From your organization's perspective and what you advocate for, what do you say is the acceptable time period for which an abortion can take place? Up to what period or what month or what stage of the pregnancy?
There are different thoughts on this, and it does vary from one country to another and given different circumstances. So, for example, we could say that, up to the 20 or the 22-week mark where the person is entering into the fetal stage with their pregnancy. But there are also cases where there could be a late-term abortion that is necessary to save the life of the mother. There are so many different reasons for abortions, for this very necessary medical procedure. And we're often looking at it from a very, very narrow standpoint and from a very judgmental standpoint, making lots of assumptions about the person who needs the abortion. And it really, really depends on the medical situation there and what is happening with that person physically, mentally, and emotionally.
Let me ask you, in your experience and from what data that you have access to, is it the majority of women make these decisions for medical reasons or for personal and economic reasons?
are so many reasons, and in many cases, they are intertwined. So it can be quite difficult to tease it out and say one reason that person would be making this decision. In many cases, because it's unplanned, it's unintended, people are not prepared. You're seeing a lot of people who are just simply not prepared to bring another person into the world and be responsible for taking care of that person. We're in an economic state right now where so many people don't have jobs or are barely making enough to get by. You really, even to live in a one-bedroom apartment, it's quite difficult to do just on one income. There are so many layers to this. There are people who are very young, who have other aspirations, other things that they want to do with their life. And we really have to think about the fact that we are pushing people to continue unwanted and unintended pregnancies, telling them that this is your punishment. You now need to carry this to term. Because this is what you have to deal with now, but we're not providing any support to the same people after they have the child, after they give birth. There is very little support, and in fact, there is judgment when they ask for support, when they ask for help, when they end up taking to the media to say, "This is my plight. I am living in a car with my 3 children. I need help." And the judgment's on them.
What impact do you believe the current abortion laws in the Bahamas have on women's health and safety?
The laws are quite restrictive, and in many cases, in previous years, it has pushed women who want to access abortion to do so very privately, very quietly, kind of whispering around, trying to find out how they can access it. But those who have money, those who have the financial resources, tend to fly out of the country and go to a state where they know that they're able to access this service. So, and it requires quite a bit of money to be able to do that. You need your flights, you need accommodations. You likely need someone to go with you to support you, not knowing what to expect throughout that process and after the procedure, after the medical abortion itself. And now that things have changed in the US with the overturn of Roe versus Wade, it is really putting us in a tough position where even more now people are trying to find the services locally, and in many cases trying to do it themselves. The DIY abortions. We're going back to the 70s and the 80s.
I wanna touch on that for a bit. Do we find that a lot of women are turning to these backdoor situations, or these untrained or non-professionals to do these abortions, or trying to do things themselves and putting their own health at risk?
Absolutely. It's not the majority, certainly. Most people will find the places that they can access it more safely. But as these restrictions come in, as we get more of this very negative, very conservative rhetoric coming from the US through the US media, and as the people who provide these services become a bit more nervous about doing it, we're turning to each other. We're turning to our elders to find out how they did it, because we know that they've done it. They've had, 12, 13 children and decided they needed to stop, and they had to figure out ways to do it. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's just stories that people have told without any kind of evidence base, and you give it a try and it doesn't work. Sometimes it just means that you remain pregnant. Sometimes it has much, much worse, more horrific consequences.
We just, before this segment, had a pro-life advocate on who talked about the concern of abortions being used in the United States and other places to harvest organs, and that being a major concern. How do you respond?
Now we're really getting into conspiracy theories and throwing out very, very wild assumptions and stories, and it's fear-mongering. The reality is that most abortions are not surgical. Most, when we get there early enough, are medical abortions. There are no organs, there are no body parts coming out to harvest. Many abortions are taking place at home through medicine. That is the fact of it.
How does the pro-choice movement address, though, the concerns about the potential misuse or overuse of abortion as a form of birth control?
It's a very interesting argument that comes up again and again, as though having an abortion is a carnival. It is not a lot of fun. Anyone who has had an abortion can tell you that it is not a good time. It is a necessary medical treatment. It is a necessary procedure that so many people need. And generally 1 in 4 people need to have an abortion at some point. And it's not something that you want to go through again and again and again. It is not something that really works as a form of contraception. There are so many different forms of contraception out there. Not all of them are particularly accessible. Not everyone knows how to access them. It's quite difficult to navigate the system of public clinics in the Bahamas in particular, and understanding which days for women and which days for what, and where can you go to access the patch, or what if you want the IUD or some other form of contraceptions. People are having problems with birth control pills because there are really serious side effects that come with some of these contraceptives. But no one is saying, you know what, I'm just not going to use contraception at all. And if something happens, I'm very happy to go through the painful process of an abortion. That is simply not something that is happening.
Interesting. In what ways can we improve the support system for women who are facing these unintended pregnancies? In a previous conversation, we spent a lot of time talking about the need of, or the need for, and the lack of support for women, whether they be, carrying the child, or even after, or in the case of the unwanted child who is now born. What happens, and do we need to give some serious focus to those support systems?
You have to start at the very beginning with comprehensive sexuality education. There are so many people who make it all the way to pregnancy without knowing very much about our bodies and how they function and how they do not function. And creating a space for people to talk about their experiences of pregnancy and the birthing experience. Because, in many cases, people will say, oh, it was the most beautiful thing. I'm so happy that I have my child. And then when you have your experience and you say, my goodness, this horrible thing happened, then people will say, oh, yeah, that happened to me too. It was terrible. So there's a need for more openness. There's a need for more people to be able to engage, to be able to honestly share their stories. And at Equality Bahamas, we're currently conducting research on the postpartum experiences of mothers and people who are giving birth. And it's quite interesting to hear what they are learning while pregnant, what they have learned since giving birth, and the inequality in the systems and the inconsistencies in systems. So we have some mothers who say, yes, after I gave birth, the midwife came in and told me how to breastfeed my child. And some who said, what? No midwife came to me. I had to pay a lactation consultant because I was having issues with breastfeeding. So there isn't consistent, reliable support even for women who are carrying pregnancies to term, because that's what they choose to do, or the women who are doing that because they weren't able to access an abortion or didn't know how to gain access to an abortion. So we have a lot of work to do along the full spectrum of sexuality and of sexual health and rights.
So let me ask you now, and it's something you touched on when you talked about sex education. How important is that comprehensive sex education and contraception in reducing the number of abortions? And what kinds of additional steps do we need to take? Because often you have a lot of these unwanted pregnancies because it comes down to simply a lack of protection, or, as you alluded to, just a lack of knowledge.
Comprehensive sexuality education is critical to minimizing, to reducing, to even possibly eliminating unwanted, unplanned pregnancies. We need everyone to understand what contraception options are out there, what is available, and what you can access in particular free of charge, and what is the cost of other forms of contraception, and what are some of the side effects that you might experience. There are some side effects that might go on for as long as you are on a particular contraceptive, and there are some that will actually go away after a few months. So how do you know if you should ride it out or not? There are also some practices that people say work that we know are not reliable, right? So the withdrawal method, people talk about this all the time. We also need to talk to girls and boys, women and men, about this sort of coercing people into sexual activities, and coercing people into sexual activities without use at all or without proper use of contraception. And the issue with practices like stealthing, where a condom is removed in the midst of activity without letting the woman know. So these are things that are happening that we need to be aware of. We need to know that these are things that happen. We need to know what condom negotiation should look like and the red flags for somebody who actually does not care about you or what happens to your body or what the consequences are, and how to spot someone who definitely will not be with you through those consequences. All of these are conversations that have to happen within comprehensive sexuality education. We're talking about consent. We're talking about pleasure, right? The idea that sex is supposed to be something that is enjoyable. People want to stay away from that, but it's important that we know we are supposed to enjoy it. It's not supposed to be something that feels wrong or bad or causes pain.
So how do you now have that conversation, though, when the institution of the church is saying abstinence is what we are standing on, it's what we have always stood for, it's what we will continue to stand for, and we're not advocating for these types of for contraception and safe sex because it encourages or it gives platform to sex outside of marriage or premarital sex or these things which it dawns as a sin. So how do you begin to have that discussion when the church is standing firm on its position of abstinence?
Abstinence definitely works when it works. We also have to be very realistic and understand what is happening within our society, what is happening at a particular age with teenagers where they want to experiment. Hormones are raging, different things are happening within their bodies, and we have to ensure that they have information. We cannot depend on them going along with abstinence because it's happening in their head when other parts of their body are telling them, explore. You don't have to go too far. Let's just see what it feels like. It is better to equip them with the information that they need to be able to make better decisions. They might not be the best decisions. They might not be the ones that we hope for. We can hope for abstinence. We can encourage abstinence, but we also want them to know the rest, right? Abstinence is the A in the ABCs of having safe sex, right? So we also need to make sure that we are equipped with other forms or real forms of contraceptives. And we need to ensure that there's faithfulness between partners because we're also concerned about STIs. We have to have this full conversation. And, the church has its place. The issue is that it wants to impose on every other institution and every part of society. But we have to recognize that, first of all, the Bahamas, as much as we want to believe it is a Christian nation, is a secular state. We have the right to make our own decisions. We have the right to not align with or conform to Christianity. We have lots of different ideas, lots of different people. It's not a law to follow any particular religion. But it is the responsibility of the government to ensure that people have access to education and can make informed decisions, and that we can access the healthcare services that we need in order to follow up on the education that we receive.
Interesting. You said a secular state. That's a whole other show and topic. Our final question, though, how do you address the argument that legalizing abortion could lead to a decline in societal values and moral standards?
This is such an very interesting take. We have to be very realistic about where we are in society right now. We have families, households, and in particular, women heading households that are struggling, really struggling to get by. And I want people to be very realistic about what it means to struggle, what it means to be a single mother trying to eat and clothe and otherwise take care of 3 or 4 children, right, on a very limited income. Sometimes that means you have to take on another job. Sometimes that means you barely see your children. And then what happens? We end up seeing in the headlines stories about young people and wondering, well, where was the mother? Right? The blame is always on the mother. Where was she? She was working her 2nd or 3rd job to make sure that these children eat. So sorry that she's not able to be 24/7 surveillance for these children. Sometimes it means the mother needs that second income, has a relationship with somebody. That person might not be perfect, but they are bringing in some much needed funds into that household. That person could be a predator, or that person could refuse to use contraception. Maybe she isn't able to access or doesn't know about contraceptions that men don't necessarily see or don't have to be aware of, ends up pregnant again. If she's not able to access an abortion, is that a 4th or 5th child now into this home? This man might take off And then it's a cycle that continues. Sometimes the young people, the children, get pulled into it. They need to help to make money in the house. So that means they're out there at night working, or they might be engaged in a relationship with an older man. All of these things are connected. And we can actually stop it by ensuring that we are providing the necessary social services and support to people who need it. And we're providing comprehensive sexuality education, and people are able to, without judgment, speak to medical professionals about their needs and access the products, the services, and the resources that they need to enable them to make wise decisions for themselves and for their families.
Alicia, that was a great perspective. We want to thank you so much for bringing balance to this discussion tonight. Often we will form opinions just based on one side of the argument. And thank you for coming on and really helping us to flesh this issue out and giving us a lot of great insight and a lot of good food for thought. We thank you so much, and continue the work, great work that you're doing and the work that your organization is doing.
Thank you for having this conversation. I hope that we'll be able to continue it and expand it going forward.
Most definitely. Thank you very much. We're going to take a break and come back with final thoughts right here on The Record. I want to extend my deepest gratitude to our guests for their contributions and willingness to engage in this critical discussion. Your perspectives have enriched our understanding and have undoubtedly sparked further reflection among our viewers. To our audience, thank you for joining us tonight. We encourage you to continue the conversation with your friends, families, and of course, communities. Until next time, I'm Jerome Sawyer, and this has been On the Record. Good night, everyone.